Okay, so thank you very much all for joining. That's given us some time for the people to get connected. So we can get started. I wanted to welcome everyone to this opening session of the Thank God It's Monday Challenge webinar series. As I mentioned before, we have over 300 people from all over the world registered for this live session. So good morning to those of you following us in America, good afternoon to those in Europe, and good night to those in Asia. As I mentioned before, for those lucky ones up to 100 that will be able to connect via Zoom, you can use the chat utility of Zoom to send us your questions, and our team will be collecting them, and at the end of the session, we'll have a few minutes to ask probably not all of them, but at least some of them to our guest. So before we go on with the webinar, I wanted to mention why we're doing this. And the reason is because we think what's going on right now, it's a fantastic opportunity for a change in mindset. I think that for the first time in human history, we've had the opportunity that we have right now to connect to ourselves and to have some time to think about what's going on in life. And one of those things that we should thinking about is what's going on with business. What have we done wrong so far, and how we could improve in the future. And one of the reasons, or the main reason why we wanted to do this, is because I think now we have time to think precisely about that, how we can think in terms of how we could improve the way we conduct business in the near future. And the reason why we call it a challenge, many of you may be wondering why a challenge, is because we thought that this would be also a great opportunity for creating or for self-creating a thought stream generated by thought leaders, world's top thought leaders, on what's this opportunity that we are talking about. We want to hear from them, what's their views. We want to hear views from different angles, from an economy perspective, from a political perspective, from a philosophical perspective, from a technology perspective. What are those opportunities? And we want to connect them all and have a 360-degree view of how coronavirus can create the context for evolution, evolution in the direction of a more conscious world. So that's why that's the opportunity we see, and we think that the challenge is that this thought stream is self-generated, because every guest that we're gonna have is gonna suggest, is gonna invite the next guest, and it's gonna pose a question for him or for her. And our first guest is Raj Sisodia. We're honored to have him. It's the co-founder of the Conscious Capitalism movement. And it's an honor to having open up this series of inspirational webinars. I guess most of you know Raj. He needs little introduction. He's a world-renowned speaker and best-selling author of many books, such as Conscious Capitalism, which is kind of our Bible, Everybody Matters, Shakti Leadership, and the Healing Organization, amongst many others. So thank you very much, Raj, for taking some time out of your agenda to be with us today and kick off what we're sure is going to be a very successful webinar series.
You're welcome. Very pleased to be with you today and with all the people who are joining in.
Thank you very much. So first of all, how are you? I'm sure that you must be confined at home, like I guess everyone else that's watching us right now. How has this virus impacted you and your life and your business and your day-to-day living? You're used to traveling all over the world constantly. How has that changed?
Yeah, no, it was kind of a rude shock. I think it is for all of us, but for me, it's like going 100 miles an hour and then suddenly zero. You know, I mean, I came back from India on February 16th, and I think I had 6 trips planned between then and now. And of course, everything has gotten canceled. And so it was kind of a stunned feeling in the beginning, you know, and I think sort of got a little bit paralyzed. It's like, oh my God, what is this? I think like many of us, we just kind of backed off and we were just watching Netflix and, you know, retreating into our cocoon a little bit. So I think that lasted a week or 10 days. And then I think as we started to wake up and say, wow, this is going to go on for a while, and there's a lot happening in the world. There's a lot of suffering, obviously, as a consequence of this. And I've been immersed in this idea of healing for the last few years. With the last book that I wrote, and even before that, I had been thinking about it for quite a while. And I said business has a major role to play here in the healing of society at all times, but certainly now. And now is a time, I think it's kind of the Chinese character for crisis is the same as that for opportunity. And I think that truly is the case today. That if we, it depends, it's always in the framing. How do we look at something? So we can look at this as a pure sort of disaster and tragedy and taking away financial wealth and all kinds of things. But hidden within that also is, I think, a significant opportunity. And I think that's what we can explore here today.
There's always a half full glass to any story, right? Good. So obviously we're being bombed by bad news of how this is gonna impact business and our personal lives, and definitely a lot of people are suffering, even the loss of their relatives and friends. But there's also, as you were saying, a positive side to it. From a personal perspective, are there any takeaways in your personal life that you are already experiencing from what's going on right now?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more contemplation. The forced slowdown, gives you time to think about and zoom out a little bit and think about the bigger picture and, where life has been evolving towards, and where there's a possibility here to shift direction. I think what we realize after a while is that we need to reach out, not only respond to inquiries and requests like yours, but also create something as well. So we've launched a couple of healing circles with leaders, and one with young people as well. It's a very confusing time for young people, and a kind of disheartening moment for them to see everything that's going on. So we're trying to reach out in those ways and see if we can learn together and provide some healing and some framing of this for each other.
Okay. And looking at the wider scope, now going beyond yourself and your most immediate surroundings, if we look at humanity, you were saying before that there's always room for opportunity in any crisis. In fact, when everything goes well, there's no opportunity for growth at all because everything stays as it was. It makes no sense to change things when things are fine, right? So only growth only comes out of crisis, right? So what do you think, from your perspective, is the big opportunity for growth that humanity has after this thing is over?
Well, so the way I think about it is that we have a medical crisis, but simultaneously we also have a leadership crisis or a management crisis, if you will. How do we respond to this in the immediate future? And then how do we evolve from this as we go forward? And I think, the blessing inside of this virus really is that it is presenting us with a massive shared global challenge. And we all have to respond. Nobody is spared from this. Doesn't matter if you're a developed country, underdeveloped, if you're a rich person, poor person. Maybe it's affecting the elderly more, but certainly the young are not exempt from it. So it's affecting everybody. So it's, in that sense, it's creating that sense of oneness, right? This planet is one system. Humanity is one spirit. We're all interconnected. We're all interdependent. Even if we stay healthy, we could be impacting others. So that connectivity, I think, is what it's awakening us to. It's also mobilizing us on a massive scale. It's mobilizing governments, of course, but it's mobilizing the education sector. Universities and schools are having to transform and grow rapidly. It's certainly mobilizing the business sector. That's the managerial crisis. And it's the kind of challenge which I believe it's first of all extremely urgent and extremely important, but also within our scope to be able to manage. We kind of know what we have to do, and we can mobilize to do that. And hopefully we can then contain it. There'll be a lot of suffering and there'll be a lot of economic dislocation, but we will recover from that. And the suffering, hopefully we can keep it as little as possible. But I think the more significant thing is that this then is something that's going to give us mechanisms of collaboration, of cooperation, of rapid action, I think it's going to build some new neural pathways for us. It's going to create more relationships. It's going to create some muscle memory. Like, how do we deal with massive crises? And I think the key thing to remember is that this is not certainly the last of these crises, and certainly not the biggest. I mean, there are other larger health crises that can happen, pandemics, but also, of course, we face collective challenges, which are even greater. Climate change being probably the most visible of them, but even things like the species extinction that we are going through right now. The fifth mass extinction in the history of our planet, and this one caused by human activity to a large extent. And what that does in an interconnected, interdependent ecosystem, when there's an insect apocalypse, what does that do to our food systems and just nature in general? So I think mobilizing against challenges that are urgent but not quite as urgent. In other words, there is time. It's not happening tomorrow or this week, but certainly it's coming within a short order. But they're even more important. So I think what happens, our attention gets focused on that which is urgent and important. And then it gets focused on that which is urgent, and the things that are truly important get left out. And I think this will give us the opportunity to collaborate on those things. We have to. Those are even larger existential threats to our survival on this planet than what we are faced with today.
Mm-hmm. You were talking about the interconnectedness of everything. In fact, we're connected even to viruses, right? And you just said that when something disappears from our ecosystem, that has a ripple effect, and you don't know what ends up happening. When we were talking before, you mentioned this idea. I forgot the name of the person that you brought up, but you told me about somebody that has this theory that viruses are an engine of evolution, right? And when you look at what's going on today, we understand virus as a negative thing, right? Nobody could possibly think of a virus as a good thing, but it might turn out that we would not be here were it not for viruses. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that theory. Actually, viruses are needed for evolution in general, and how we can give a completely different interpretation of what's going on right now, how this is an opportunity.
Right. So this is an essay by Charles Eisenstein. And if you look his name up and go to his website, you'll see his latest essay. He's a brilliant thinker on many subjects. And he wrote a book called The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Believe is Possible, or something like that. That's one of his several books. But this essay is called The Coronation. And it's a fairly long essay, but he's really looking at all of the aspects of this and how we're responding to it, and what are the systems and structures in place that are causing us to respond in a certain way, and what the consequences of that might be. But one of the things that he addresses in there is the notion of the role that viruses historically have played in evolution. That viruses bring strands of RNA, of genetic material into another life form, right? And that is what has allowed species to actually evolve from where they are. Otherwise, we would be static. So again, there is a way in which the virus can be a medicine. It can be something that is needed at some level. We may not understand it right away, but we can certainly look at maybe not the physical impact it's going to have, but certainly the impact it's having on society, and see what are the things that we can learn from that and take away from that and evolve our systems. There are many things in society that need fixing. And in the short term, we are starting to address, homelessness, for example, right? And so in California, they're buying hotels to house the homeless. Prisons are extremely crowded, and I mean, there are way too many people in prison in the U.S., and we're starting to see the crisis in that world. So we're doing certain short-term things there, but I think all of these aspects of society we need to look at with fresh eyes, and we need to look at to see how do we transform them.
Yeah, you talked about viruses being medicines, and I'm absolutely convinced that if you look at this coronavirus from the point of view of Earth, they are definitely, the coronavirus is definitely a medicine, and we're probably the virus, and the virus is the antibody in this case. you've talked generally on what kind of things humanity should learn from this, what are the takeaways, and how things should change. Could you actually talk a bit more specifically about how businesses can contribute to the change, how this idea that we defend of conscious capitalism can be a movement for change and take advantage of the current situation for the better?
Yeah, but just one thought on the other topic that we were talking about, because this is a shared threat that we're all facing, as often happens, we forget about our petty differences with each other, right? When we have that. And by the way, even crime is down significantly, as one would expect, but the murders in Chicago are down almost 80%. Right. So there are things that happen when something like this we faced with, we let go of some of our petty things that divide us and that we're arguing about. I think
that's interesting.
Yeah.
No,
I mean, I was curious.
When you were saying this, it just occurred to me, what if we could balance out how many people are dying of the virus and how many people are not dying from other things thanks to the virus? I'd like to know what the balance is, because maybe it's not what we think.
Yeah, that possibly could be, and the net long-term outcome could be that, But I think when we come to the world of business, I think certainly this is a major moment of truth. Okay, this is the ultimate crucible moment in which businesses will either step up or not. If you look at the last year in the world of business, before we had this coronavirus, we had a lot of significant steps that were being taken, or people talking about changing the way we think about business. So the Business Roundtable in August issued a statement around the purpose of business after decades, almost 50 years, where they had talked about the only purpose of business is to create economic value. They said business needs to be about creating value for all stakeholders: customers, employees, communities, the families of employees, the environment, etc. And there needs to be a purpose to every business. So what conscious capitalism we've been talking about since 2008 started becoming kind of a mainstream idea last year, at least in words. Right? So Business Roundtable represents 183 of the largest companies in the US. Before that, Larry Fink and BlackRock for few years had been talking about BlackRock being the largest money manager in the world, close to $7 trillion. And for a few years now, he's been urging companies, and in fact helping companies evolve towards purpose, towards long-term, and towards a stakeholder orientation, actively pushing these ideas of conscious capitalism, because without that, we cannot survive. The fact is that if we continue doing business as usual, and you just take one example of that, in the last 12 years, many public companies have used the bulk of their profits in two things, primarily in share buybacks and then in dividends. Right? In some cases, more than 100% of earnings have gone towards those two things, right? Which means you're not investing for the future. You're certainly not investing in your other stakeholders. And you're actually borrowing money to buy back your own shares, which of course benefits today's shareholders, but it also benefits today's leaders, executives who have stock options. And your stock option now artificially rises in value because you have bought back shares, and therefore you've created the perception that your share prices have gone up, whereas you haven't actually created any real value, right? So it's become a very self-serving mechanism to extract wealth from that entity and simply deliver it to a small group of people rather than looking at the totality of all stakeholders. So that's been the reality of practice in the past. In the last year, we've had all these words and some action. I think what the moment of truth now is that will our actions in this moment live up to those words? And I think the good news is that more companies than not are actually stepping up in pretty significant ways. So if you look at, there's a website called Just Capital, one of our partners, by the way, Conscious Capitalism, along with 5 other entities, Just Capital, the B Team, the B Corp, the Coalition for Inclusive Capitalism, and CECP, which is Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose. We've all come together under the umbrella of Imperative 21 to kind of push this new story of business. Right, that business is about a higher purpose connected to the well-being of society as a whole, that it creates value for all the stakeholders. And that's how we should operate, with a long-term focus, focusing on the well-being of everybody, including the planet and the environment. So we're starting to see a lot of Just Capital has on their website a list of the 100 largest employers in the US and what each one of them is doing. with regard to their employees, with regard to their customers, right? With regard to the community and so forth. And there's a lot there. And there's a lot of things we can learn and then look at what other companies are doing and be inspired by as well. So I would say a large number of companies have stepped forward in a very caring way, that leaders who were not known for this in the past are actually, their hearts are being opened, their compassion is being awakened, and they are seeing the suffering that is so tangible now. See, we used to have a lot of hidden suffering. We had people showing up for work and going home. And the fact is, the heart attacks were 20% higher on Mondays. 120,000 Americans were dying due to stress connected to work. 600,000 Chinese were dying every year from overwork, right? I mean, the silent suffering at work was enormous. It was shortening our lives. It was having an impact on our children, on our families, on our communities. A lot of that suffering is now becoming visible. And the caring that people also feel for each other but weren't expressing as much is also becoming more visible. So that caring energy and that silent suffering, which is now coming to the fore, is allowing us to bring healing. And a lot of companies are becoming instruments of that. Right, so you start to see, and there are many examples you'll see from Just Capital, but also I just heard yesterday that Medtronic, which is a company that makes medical equipment, has released all of their patents on their ventilators and made all the information available publicly so that anybody can use that in order to produce necessary technologies. Unilever, a company that under Paul Polman over the last 10-12 years has been a poster child for being a conscious company and being aligned with sustainability and society and long-term thinking. They have also done significant things, not only in terms of the products that they're producing that we need, but also setting aside over 500 million euros to help their supply chain, help their smaller suppliers, and communities and others stay alive. Because one of the things that's happening is that many small businesses, could die in this because they don't have the reserves, and many large companies don't either. But the ones that do are the ones that need to step forward. I was reading that in India, the Tatas, again an iconic business and a highly conscious company for 130-40 years, they always show up when there's a disaster, when there's a time of need. And in Bombay, they've got these spectacular hotels, the Taj Mahal Palace and Towers, for example, where the terrorist attack had happened some years ago, and that was an extraordinary story too. But right now they're converting those hotels and making them available to doctors and nurses so that they don't have to commute far from where they are working in the hospitals. They're turning over all their kitchen staff, etc., to feed healthcare workers and others who need that, right? So there's a lot of examples of companies that are stepping up. And I believe that these are the kinds of changes that are not reversible. In other words, you can't go back to being heartless once your heart has been open and you've shown that side of yourself. As they say, you fake it till you make it. Well, if you start behaving in this way, it's going to change your being, your persona, right? And I think the other flip side of that is that the companies that don't respond in a caring way at this time of our greatest need, if companies don't do what they can for their employees, for their customers, for their communities, people will remember that too. It'll always be, what did you do when the chips were down? When we were facing this crisis, did you in fact do what you could, what was in your power to do? And if not, that will remain. That will be a burden. That will be like a scarlet letter worn by these companies, exactly, to say you didn't show up. So I think the outcome of this is companies are becoming more conscious and behaving that way, and conscious companies are going to show up in the right way. And in the long term, many unconscious companies, kind of will get weeded out of this process. It's like a forest fire cleans out some of the underbrush that enables the rest of the forest to grow in a more healthy way. That's part of the natural system. There may be some of that happening here.
Yes, definitely. And I think it's quite interesting while I was listening to you, everything that's going on right now. In fact, as you mentioned, everything was going on already. There was the declaration of the Business Roundtable, the BlackRock declaration as well. A lot of things are going on. And basically what's it's interesting to see how the universe is kind of aligning things, and what's going on now seems to be like a great opportunity for accelerating what was already happening, right? There are a lot of movements springing off everywhere. Conscious capitalism is one of them, but you mentioned a bunch before that you've joined forces. But I think that whether conscious capitalism existed or not, there's an ongoing movement, an ongoing rise of consciousness. And basically, we're all just contributing to accelerating it. And the situation we're living right now with the coronavirus is one more of those accelerators, probably the biggest one, right? Because as you were saying,
Yeah.
it's actually giving visibility to a lot of things that we were just ignoring. And now everybody is much more aware of them, right? Look, I would keep asking you questions forever, but we're running out of time, and I want to give a chance to the audience to make a few questions. So, Berta, I guess you've been collecting questions from the audience. Maybe we have time for two quick ones before we go.
Yeah, sure. So we've been receiving a few questions, but we will start with Joan Mora's ones, one of our members here in Spain. He starts by saying, well, first, thank you very much, Mr. Sisodia, for your contribution to a better world. He mentions his question doesn't aim to criticize the current world and local politics, although it's implicit. He wonders, do you believe that a global rethinking of the world as we know it is needed? And especially the global political model? And can we wait any longer for that? He adds, in some ways, borders have been shown on paper.
Yeah, I mean, I believe we have an opportunity here for greater cooperation, collaboration in all areas. I think we have been too defined by competition. I mean, competition is a good thing in small doses, right? We need it, of course, and that's part of what makes the market function well. But I think we've gone too far on that side, and we've taken that competition idea and spread it into every aspect of society, right? Within families, across countries, across cultures, across religions, and so forth. So I think it's a moment, just coming out of World War II, for example, we had all these institutions, the United Nations, World War I, World War II, many of the great institutions of the world got established coming out of that. Many great initiatives like the Marshall Plan, which enabled Japan and Europe to have a rebirth in a way. And, think about what Europe became after World War II versus what it was before. Until 1946, European nations fought 1,200 wars with each other in 600 years. Okay, 2 per year on average. Since 1946, there have been 0 wars between European nations. So look at a fundamental shift in society. There's World War II, right? But also the way we responded to that war. Because World War I, the way we responded planted the seeds for World War II, right? What happened in terms of the pressures that were put on Germany for reparations and so forth. So it's all a matter of how we respond. This is kind of our World War III, right? If you think about it, we hopefully won't have any real world wars. But how we respond to this is going to then lay the seeds for future, cooperation across the world. And I think it's a needed thing, because if you think about the turning point we came to in 1989, right, when the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I was in Berlin for our Conscious Capitalism Europe conference. We were literally right next to the wall, our hotel, right? And that's a symbol of the defining debate of the 20th century between competing ideologies: communism, socialism, government ownership and control of every aspect of our lives, and then capitalism, democracy, and freedom. And of course, that side won, right? Without a gunshot being fired, the debate was over. The wall was pulled down by people. Now, if you fast forward into recent years and the rise of populist movement, etc., I think what we've been seeing is that democracy and capitalism, which were kind of hand in hand in 1989, they are now kind of at odds, right? So a lot of people are feeling that capitalism is in fact hurting democracies in a way, that is taking power away from people and concentrating it. And so you have all these populist movements, right? In democracies that are capitalist, you have populist movements. Chile being a good example of that, probably the most capitalist society in South America, and they had massive public protests, millions of people out on the street, right? So we need to bring democracy and capitalism more back in alignment, right? Which means that ordinary people have to see the benefits of capitalism, which they haven't been seeing. In 40 years in the US, worker pay has been flat, right? And an average American, 50% of Americans have less than $400 in the bank, at a time of the economic boom that we had the last 15, 20 years, right? And the stock market had record highs. So the fact is that the fruits of that system have not been coming to everybody. And so we had those things going on. At the same time, we had the rise of state capitalism in China, and we had crony capitalism and sort of oligarchies in Russia and so forth. I think it's a time and an opportunity for us to rethink sort of the social contract, the economic contract that we have in societies. And hopefully we can start evolving towards greater cooperation, but also more evolved forms of democracy, more evolved forms of capitalism as well. I think it's kind of a forcing function for us to take a look at a lot of different things.
Okay, we have time for just one more question. I know we have many more, but unfortunately we don't have time for all of them. So Berta, shoot the last one.
Yes, so Antonio Rios was asking, what advice would you give to those of us who feel that we need to use our time better in this crisis and lockdown, but we don't know in what we should really focus?
Yeah, I think that's the challenge, all of us. I mean, we were saying, how do we serve? I mean, the question you ask yourself is, how can I serve? Right? How can I be of use? We all want to, for human beings, having a positive impact on the lives of others is fundamental to our being and our makeup, right? So how can we serve? Now, what are the skill sets that I have that can be deployed? I mean, there are many people now making masks, figuring out how to do that. Of course, people are serving, they're serving people, those who are helping others, they're helping them. So there are people who are serving the healthcare workers in whatever way that they can. They're helping their neighbors. They're reaching out. There's a wonderful, I mean, there's lots of resources on the web. One that I've been watching lately is called Some Good News. I just search for that. And that's, again, people banding together and doing all kinds of things. So I think it's an answer for each of us. For me, it was really, how can we reach out to our leaders and others who are under intense pressure? And it's unlike anything else that they've ever faced. How can we support them? Because if we can support leaders, they in turn are responsible for thousands and tens of thousands of lives, right? But if they don't take care of themselves, and we don't, like we're doing with Conscious Capitalism this Thursday, we're doing a healing circle for leaders, right? Which is Thursday afternoon, I think. So again, taking care, doing what we can based upon our abilities and our skill set. I think that's a question each of us has to ask.
Okay. Well, I'm afraid we don't have any more time left. Basically, we only have time for letting you ask a question to our next guest. As I said before, every guest is going to invite the next one. Raj already invited the next guest, who's going to be Nilima Bhatt, which is Raj's co-author of their book, Shakti Leadership. And she's going to be joining us next Monday. So Raj, what would be your question for her?
Well, before I answer that question, I mean, the last thought that I did want to leave all of us with is that, we are all here on this planet to take care of each other. That's our fundamental role, I think, in this life. And business is a way we can do that at scale. So let's think about business in that way. I can take care of 5 people, 10 people, right, on my own, perhaps. But if I start a business, I can take care of hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, potentially. So business is a great amplifier of our capacity for caring, provided that's the energy we bring to it. And I think that's the fundamental thing. If we bring to business purely a self-interested mindset that says, I'm going to start a business to serve myself and use others, whether it's employees or customers, to serve myself, and that's a business that is going to cause suffering. But if I start a business to serve others and therefore express myself, my own caring through that will lead to a tremendous amount of healing. In terms of Nilima, I've learned a lot from Nilima. She's a very, very wise person, deeply steeped in the wisdom traditions of the East as well as the West. And I learned a lot in the process of writing that book, which is about the elevation of the feminine. And I do believe that every moment of crisis is one where we need to reconnect with that idea, right? Because the feminine is what has been missing. In leadership, it's been missing from every societal institution, has been run by men on a limited set of masculine values, which were about strength and courage and resilience and focus. But in the absence of the feminine, that becomes domination, aggression, hyper competition, winning at all costs, subjugating others and so forth. And so I think bringing nurturing, caring, compassion, empathy, inclusiveness, right? All of those are the feminine values. And I think that is what is greatly called for. One of the insights that I had a couple of years ago before I started writing the Healing Organization is that in all my work, which includes the work I did with Nilima, I had a coach for the first time, and she told me after she heard the trajectory of all of my work, she said, you realize that you have been honoring your mother with your work the last 15 years. And if I said, I had not thought about it that way, but you're right. What I'm trying to bring to the world of business is everything that she stood for. She unfortunately passed away last year. But these are what she stood for. This is how she lived. This is what she embodied. And I think all of us need to bring that energy. That's what's missing in the world. And I think Nilima will lead you in a very wonderful discussion about how do we do that.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very, very much, Raj. Is there any particular question that you would like to ask her?
Yes, ask her,
She's with us.
how does the feminine need to show up in this time? How do we bring that feminine energy into the world?
We'll definitely ask that. Okay, sounds good. Okay, well, thank you very much, Raj, again for joining us in this opening session of this webinar series. Thank you, everyone, from joining wherever you are in the world. And I hope Raj just gave you a few good reasons why you should attend our next session with Nilima next Monday. If you're already registered for this event, you're already registered for the entire series, so you don't have to register again. We'll send you every Sunday the link so that you can connect online. So again, thank you, everyone. This video will be available in YouTube in case you want to share it or you want to view it again. I'm sorry we didn't have time to answer all the questions from the audience, but we wanted to stick to our 30-minute interview. And I definitely look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this, Avi.
You're welcome. Thanks.